Thank you. I want to begin our Women Get on Board speakers virtual event today by acknowledging the land in which I live is in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. The Upper Canada Treaties cover this territory, is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, the Wampum Agreement, and is directly adjacent to the Haldimand territory. Today, this is an area home to many Indigenous people, and we are all grateful to have the opportunity to enjoy the natural surroundings of this territory. I encourage all of us to become actively involved in understanding why land acknowledgements are important and in understanding Indigenous histories and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get on Board. We are a member-based company that connects, promotes, and empowers women to corporate boards. We have over 850 members across Canada with diverse in our membership diversity. Our goal is to get more women on boards. Women Get on Board is delighted to be hosting this virtual speaker series with our sponsor, Southleigh Group. They are a trusted advisor to boards and senior management with the expertise in developing innovative and customized pay and people pay programs to enhance business results. The breadth of their experiences brings together business strategy, financial analysis, human resources, management, board governance, communication, disclosure, and investor engagement. Our topic today is director compensation trends in 2023. We are excited to have Amanda Fogley, President and Managing Partner at Southleigh Group, Ryan Resch, Senior Partner at Southleigh Group, and Kim Keating, Senior Energy Sector Executive and Experienced Corporate Director of DRAC Group. They will present their findings of their annual review of S&P TSX 60 companies about director compensation pay levels, as well as best practices and governance around the form of these pay packages. So we will begin. I'm delighted to be introducing Ryan. Ryan Resch is, as I said, Senior Partner at Southleigh Group. He has worked previously at Willis Tower Watson on Toronto and Vancouver offices, where he specialized in executive comp for close to 20 years, helping companies make meaningful and drive positive business results. Ryan led many of the practice's largest clients relationships across Canada and was North America's lead for its groundbreaking research on ESG and human capital expertise. As you can see, Ryan is well accredited and well accomplished in this area to talk about director comp. I will now turn to our next speaker from Southleigh Group, which is Amanda Fogley. Amanda Fogley is the President and Managing Partner at Southleigh Group. Amanda is, after growing Canadian rewards practice over 3 years of leadership and 22 years of impactful advisory group at the Willis Tower Watson, she co-founded Southleigh Group. She is well known and trusted advisor to boards and management of many of Canada's largest and mid-sized companies, both public and private. She uses her business acumen and direct approach to solve business challenges, covering all matters related to pay levels, design, and governance. Without further ado, I am now turning it over to you, Ryan, to take us through your research report. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Deborah, for the wonderful introduction and for having us be part of this series. What I'd like to do for the next 10 minutes or so is provide a bit of a framework with respect to market research that we've done. And then Amanda and Kim will get into a more detailed discussion around many of these topics. And to set the stage in terms of the scope of the research, we looked at last year all of the TSX composite companies, so about 237 companies, looked at their director pay practices, and this is what's represented here in this report. We're planning to do this every year, so just keep in mind that this is 2022 disclosure representing 2021 pay levels, and then we'll keep updating it to keep pace with pay trends over time. As I said, this is about 240 companies. All the data is in the currency as reported. We haven't made any adjustments. So some companies may pay in US dollars versus Canadian dollars. We've treated it all on a nominal basis here. And total compensation, as we're calculating it, is based off of the number of meetings disclosed by each company. And so it represents sort of the total pay being provided to board members in terms of retainers and meeting fees based on the actual number of meetings that they had in the year. So we're going to kick it off here and talk a little bit about board member compensation. And this is total compensation. So this again is the sum of any retainers that are provided, both cash and equity retainers, and meeting fees where they're provided. And we'll get into a little bit more detail on each of these elements as we go through. But to set the stage, we'll start high level and look at total compensation. And you can see in the graph here, we're showing the 25th, 50th, and the 75th percentile of the findings. And so the bottom of the bar is the 25th percentile, where the dark meets the light gray, it's the 50th percentile, and at the top of the bar, it's the 75th percentile. And so if we look at the total sample, the first bar in the graph, you can see there that pay ranges somewhere between $125,000 and $210,000 within the TSX composite. And as you can imagine, there's 240 companies in this group, and there's a wide range of companies in terms of from some of the smaller companies to some of Canada's largest companies. And when we looked at the data, there's a clear relationship between company size and pay. And that's what you see in the next three bars. So you can clearly see that the smallest group within the composite with less than $2.5 billion in market cap sort of pay in the middle, somewhere just under 150,000. If you're mid cap between 2.5 billion to 10 billion in market cap, you're closer to about 160,000. And then if you're one of the largest companies in Canada with more than 10 billion in market cap, your median pay is closer to 225,000. But again, as you look at it, there's also a wide range of pay within each size category, and that starts to reflect some of the industry differences, the global scale and complexity of organizations that even if they're the same size, they may have different talent markets for directors and different competitive markets in which they're competing, and therefore they have different pay opportunities. So this can provide a good starting point to understand sort of what is a reasonable range of pay by company size, but you do need to sort of start to dig a little deeper to understand what works, what is best for your organization, for the types of directors that you're recruiting. The final comment I'll make here is, again, that this is 2021 compensation. And so what we do anticipate in working with a number of companies over the past year is that we do anticipate that this will increase going forward, somewhere between 5 to 10% per year. So as we start to look forward, it's important, I think, as directors, when you're looking at market data, in many cases, you are forecasting out over a period of time because you're not necessarily making these adjustments on an annual basis. In many cases, you're making an adjustment for a 2 to 3 year basis. So as you think about it, in many cases, we would want to sort of add a bit of a factor here to anticipate the changes that we expect to see in the market. And so that would be an important consideration as you look at this data. If we go to the next slide, we'll start to break down in terms of how compensation gets delivered. And so I'll start with the board members at the top. And you can see there that there's sort of three main components of compensation: a cash retainer, an equity retainer, and then meeting fees. And we show in the middle column there the prevalence of each of these. And obviously a cash retainer is virtually universal. Equity retainers are very common. But the use of meeting fees, you can see there only about 1 in 5 companies continue to still provide a meeting fee for board members. And that's a shift. We've seen that shift over time where it was fairly commonplace, but we're sort of moving into a greater era of fee simplification. And so what we're seeing is that the embedded meeting fee sort of spend is now being incorporated increasingly within the retainer overall. So companies are looking at what is a normal number of meetings and building that into their overall retainers. And the idea there is that in generally speaking, is that a lot of activity happens outside of the meeting, and so not necessarily needing to pay additionally per meeting, and that the role of the director is more all-inclusive, and therefore you can incorporate that within the retainer. And just to clarify, I know the question just popped up around, what is a retainer? And the retainer is essentially, you can think of it similar to sort of a salary that would be provided. It's a total pay that's provided to recognize the board member service. And so, for instance, cash retainer here, $80,000 would be the total fee paid for cash to the director for their service for the year. It's sometimes paid on a quarterly basis, but that would be the total retainer being paid to them. The equity retainer, we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how that's structured, but that's usually then in the form of shares. And in this case, about $100,000 worth of shares would be delivered to the director in recognition of their service. So that gives you a sense of, as a board member, this is what I would get paid. And then in many cases, you also sit as a board member on various committees. And you can see here that about half of the companies, it's somewhat mixed, provide additional compensation if you sit on a committee. Not necessarily the chair of the committee, but if you're a member, for instance, of the audit committee, about 60% of companies provide committee member fees of about $10,000 a year to be a member of the audit committee. It's typically, again, paid as a retainer, so you get sort of a set number of dollars per year for being a member, and about 1 in 5 provide meeting fees for attending committee meetings. So usually, again, the $1,500 provided for every meeting that you attend. So that gives you a sense of, as a member, this is what I can earn in terms of as a board member, and then as a committee member, how I would be paid. And then you'll see on the next slide, we talk about leadership roles. And so we've split this up between board leaders on the top and committee chairs on the bottom. And so if you are a board chair, about 75% of the TSX composite have an independent board chair that gets paid separately. The total compensation for that board chair is about $300,000. And what we're also showing there is a multiple. And so what that multiple represents is that, in essence, a board chair earns about 1.8 times what a board member would earn, which is generally within a broad range that we would look at, somewhere between 1.5 to 2 times our board member compensation we would pay to the board chair. And the board chair essentially is taking on increased responsibilities, obviously an increased workload, increased scrutiny, increased risk and responsibility. And so therefore they get compensated more for that. And the range that they get compensated in addition to the board members can reflect sort of the increased difficulty or challenges that the board chair might face. So in some cases, you see that going closer to 2 times a board member, or sometimes closer to 1.5 times if it's relatively lower workload. It's similar for lead directors. So about 28% of the TSX composite have a lead director. And so a lead director is usually in place if there's a non-independent board chair. You have a lead director step into that role, but the role is not as complex or as time intensive as it is for a board chair. And so you can see there that the pay for a lead director is lower at about $215,000, or about 1.2 times what a board member would earn. So there's a sort of a not as much of a differential for a lead director as you would see for a board chair. But again, some of that can vary depending on sort of the scope and of the lead director, the complexity, the responsibilities that they have relative to the board chair. If you have a board chair that's not as active and the lead director actually plays more of the board director role or the board chair role, sorry, you could have a higher multiple or a higher pay for that lead director. So again, it does vary very much depending on the circumstance. And then in terms of committee chairs, you can see there that the prevalence of additional compensation for committee chairs is fairly common and virtually universal for an audit committee chair, and very common for either the compensation or the nominating governance committee. And the total compensation there can vary somewhere between $15,000 for a nominating governance committee chair, $20,000 for compensation, and $25,000 for audit. And again, historically, we've seen a premium being paid to the audit committee chair simply because the audit committee tends to have either more meetings, it's more of a time commitment, more about the risk associated with it. And so there has historically been a greater premium paid to the audit committee. Whereas compensation in HR, we've started to see that creep up over time, where given the additional responsibilities falling within the HR committee, we've started to see that one step up in terms of its pay relative to the other committees, and start to get closer and closer to the audit committee. And I know that's going to be something that Amanda and Kim will talk a little bit more about in terms of the evolution going forward between the various committee chairs. And I know there's been some questions around coming through, say, for instance, the risk committee, et cetera. We focused here on the study in terms of the three main committees. Usually what we find is that some of the other committees tend to be closer to sort of what we would see here for the nominating governance committee in terms of a standard committee fee. But again, the risk committee, because it can vary in terms of scope depending on industry, you can see a wide variability in pay associated with the risk committee. And so then if we go to the next slide for the final one, we look at equity compensation. So going back to the beginning where we said there was a mix between a cash retainer and an equity retainer, about 55% of total compensation tends to be provided in equity. So if they said, you know, we're going to pay you $100,000 per year to serve as a board member, 55,000 would be provided in equity, and the balance in cash. In this case, equity compensation is typically provided as a deferred share unit. And so a deferred share unit has a special regulation within the Income Tax Act that allows you to defer tax until you leave the board. And so that's why you see there that over 80% of the TSX composite provide the equity retainer in the form of a DSU, which allows that long tax deferral. And so you get to accumulate shares on a pre-tax basis. And then when you leave the board, those DSUs get paid out to you. And so that has been the most common. And again, Amanda and Kim will talk a little bit more about what we're seeing going forward. But to set the stage, you see there about 80% provide DSUs, 15% provide an RSU, which is a restricted share unit. And so those have a more specific time horizon associated with them before they pay out, typically 3 years, so that you would receive them. And then within when they vest, they would pay out to you. And then about 8% of companies still grant stock options. They tend to be within some of the smaller companies, and they tend to be more common, particularly around startups or juniors. You see the use of stock options from a governance perspective. We've seen most larger organizations move away from the use of stock options and using more of a share unit, either the RSU or the DSU. And the final point I'll make here is in terms of share ownership. So almost all of the TSX composite companies disclose a share ownership requirement. They're typically expressed as a multiple of the cash retainer, and it's usually around 3 times that cash retainer that needs to be achieved within a certain period of time. That practice is somewhat mixed, and so in some cases it could be based off of the total retainer. And so that's just something as you look at and compare to others within your industry, just to be aware of how they define it, because 3 times a cash retainer of $80,000 is a lot different than 3 times a total retainer of $150,000. And so having clarity on how that's defined and how much equity is required to be owned is important as you look at those share ownership requirements. And in terms of their design, for the most part, directors can meet those guidelines through the equity retainer. So again, by providing the DSU grants on an annual basis over a reasonable period of time, directors can accumulate sufficient ownership to align with those underlying requirements. So with that, I know there's been some questions coming in. I think some of those questions may get addressed as part of the fireside chat. If not, we'll revisit them as we get to the Q&A part at the end of the presentation. So I will pause there and turn it over to Amanda and Kim.
Thank you very much, Ryan. That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing the research to date. And now Kim and I will do a bit of a conversation and dialogue around the future of director compensation, because as Ryan suggested, that was a little bit backwards looking because it was based on 2022 disclosure, 2021 pay levels. So we want to sort of talk about what is going on in the boardrooms today. What are the topical items that are trying to be wrestled to the ground in terms of the future of director compensation? And there's no specific answers, but we're just going to pick Kim's brain a little bit on her thoughts, or personal thoughts, because she is a member of many boards and has lots of experiences to share, but it'll just be her thoughts and her experiences as it relates to the evolution of director compensation. So a little bit more about Kim here. She's our board member that we've selected and she's agreed to share. She's a professional engineer by training who over her career had multiple leadership roles in various industrial companies, including Petro-Canada, as well as leading Cahill, Canada's largest multidisciplinary construction company with operations across Canada. So throughout her career, she's made significant contributions to major projects in the Canadian, Norwegian, and UK energy sectors, bringing a wealth of strategy, operational leadership, and technical expertise to her role. And in addition to her numerous volunteer leadership roles on different important charities and foundations, she's currently the board chair of Major Drilling International and a board member of both Yamana Gold and Drax Group, PLC. So with that resume, you won't be surprised that she also has won multiple engineering awards and is among Canada's top 100 most powerful women and the Atlantic Canada's top 25 most powerful women in business. So thanks so much for your time today, Kim. I really appreciate it. Jumping right in, with the evolution of just the role of the boards and the different aspects of governance that companies are now having to face, and the stewardship role, you know, most topically, people are talking about ESG and what that means to different companies, deeper topics around human capital and what that means to organizations. We can expect that this does have an impact on how organizations organize their boards, how they delegate responsibilities across committees. And so our question to you is, what's been your experience of that evolution, and what do you think the impact of that change in governance and oversight might mean to the way in which directors are paid?
Great question, Amanda. But before I get started, I just want to thank you and Ryan and the Southleigh Group and Women Get On Board. Deborah, just a big thank you for the invite today and the opportunity to participate. So great question. I started my board experience back, or my public board experience anyway, back in 2016, 2017. So even in that short period of time, I have seen some evolution. You know, there's no doubt that the conversations, I mean, health, safety, environment, social responsibility have always been key themes around the boardroom table. But I would say, you know, the ESG now has definitely become a topic of not just critical importance, but very, you know, almost transformational in some respects in terms of how we think about risk and board governance. So, you know, now the conversations around the table, you know, you would often have HSE committees or sustainability committees. You know, you have your nominating, your remuneration and or compensation. Now the conversation is really which committee will ESG reside in. Sometimes it's split, you know, you have environment in one, you know, the social in another perhaps, and governance alone, you know, or sorry, in a separate committee. So I'm finding that there's a lot more conversations, to your point, around how do we make sure that we don't miss anything or you know, nothing falls through the crack. And I think I saw a question earlier about a risk committee. Oftentimes there's a discussion around that as well. Do we have, I've had experience with ad hoc risk committees where there's a particular area that we want to kind of dive into for a period of time. But sometimes there are conversations around should the ESG component reside in that committee. I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer. On every board I'm on, there's something different. But there's no doubt that we're talking about it a lot more than we ever did even 2, 3, 4 years ago. And in terms of compensation, I would say, and I was reflecting on this since you and I chatted last week, I'm actually seeing in some of my boards and some of the compensation advisors that I work with that, not necessarily in Canada, primarily outside of Canada, but the committees now, there's less distinguishing between the committees. So typically audit always had a premium, followed by typically, remuneration, compensation, HR, and then, the governance and or what other, the other committee, sustainability, what have you. But there are more instances now where some aren't making any, distinguishing at all in terms of they're all getting paid the same. But the closer to seem to be the that I've seen anyway have been the audit and the compensation.
Right.
But I am seeing the ESG wherever that sits kind of equaling out. So, I guess time will tell, but certainly the responsibilities of the chairs and the board members, they're not getting any less. There's more and more and more, I'm finding.
Yeah, that was one of the questions that sort of popped up as well in the chat feature in terms of someone's asking about the rate of change over time. Something we talked about in our pre-call also in terms of that there just is more pressure. There was definitely a lull during COVID when there was no appetite to talk about paying ourselves more. But since then, we'd suggest that many organizations are quick to be looking at overall competitiveness of compensation, and the numbers are going up. I think it'll be interesting this year when, like Ryan said, this exact report will be updated and republished in the next couple of months as the new proxies come out. Will be fascinating to see if there's been a larger than normal increase to directors' compensation in the decisions that have been most recently changed. I was going to ask us specifically about your opinion of the differentiation of audit versus the other committees, and you've sort of hit it on the head. And I guess I'd say we also would reflect on Ryan's data there in terms of, you identified it, that what's closer is HR to audit, and that actually has come with the scrutiny of HR with say on pay. The fact that investors can vote against the chair of the committee, that is very different from the experience that the chair of the committee had multiple years ago. How do you feel about the differentiation of audit specifically? Is that continue to be something that's important to differentiate in your view?
I guess what I would say is that I'm okay with that. Because there's no doubt, audit encompasses, a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of important work, not to diminish the work of the other committees. The only thing I would say, though, is that audit is very structured. I'm not an accountant, I'm an engineer. So, but it's very structured. And, I've had the privilege of working with some fantastic audit chairs. So, and not that there's not difficult issues to tackle from time to time, but it's a fairly robust structure that they work within. Mm-hmm. Whereas some of the other committees that I've been involved with and observed, and just talking to other board colleagues, there's a lot more moving parts in terms of change as well. Now, there's no doubt, the introduction of, in the audit world, IFR, there's all sorts of things that guide that work. But there's less robust guidance, I would say, in some of the other committees. So you're sort of trying to find your way in terms of what will, as governance rules evolve. So in some respects, it's even more challenging and super important to get, great diversity and experience around the table as you kind of navigate sometimes uncharted territory. And your point around, the new guidance coming out, whether from the proxy advisors or what they can and cannot do in terms of, their voting. I mean, it's pretty serious stuff. So when you're taking this on, you really want to make sure that you're, supported, qualified, have a great team, because people are thinking a little more thoughtful, I think, about their role and, the importance, and, it's always been important, obviously, but I guess it's just a little more scrutiny right now. And I think the lens by which people are viewing this, it's a little more higher risk, quite frankly.
Absolutely. And I think that feeds into that other conclusion you had made, and that we also see at Southly, and we'll see more in the proxies that come out, is there's some organizations have made that choice to reflect it in pay, that actually the role, responsibility, risk, and accountability across the committees is becoming more and more equal. Next topic was going to be about the all-in-one retainer concept. So as we saw with the data, that only 21% of companies now provide meeting fees for showing up and attending meetings. And there's more of a focus on everyone gets the same $80,000 cash and $100,000 worth of equity annually. Kim, we were going to just chat with you a little bit about that in terms of how do you feel about that in terms of reflecting on your boards and others that you've seen. Does that make sense? And what are the considerations you think about when deciding if that makes sense?
Yeah, so in my experience, particularly around this topic of compensation, I would say that I've certainly learned that, the expectation is that you're going to keep it simple, flexible, fair, So in that regard, I'm seeing, there's no doubt there's definitely more evolution towards now, I think, rolling everything up into, a total retainer, whether that be in cash and equity, or some combination thereof. I think it makes sense in terms of kind of simplifies things. The only caveat to that would be, if you're part of a board that, there's going to be, meetings tend to be more than what I guess one would consider the norm. I think you may want to think about, again, because it may be tough, especially for a period of time, perhaps it might be tough to just roll that into a retainer. The retainer may not appear to be reasonable or within certain, I guess, best practices or what we're seeing with other companies of similar size. So I think that would be my only caveat, that if there was going to be a tendency to have a number of meetings that would feel a little more than what most would consider normal, then I think you may want to think about the committee, keeping the meeting fees. Otherwise, I think, having it, just rolled up into that retainer, and again, how you split that out, I think just makes for a little more ease in terms of administration, disclosure, and, I do think that's the way folks are moving, or it appears to be anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. We would agree with you based on our consulting experience. And as you were indicating, sometimes there's actually the number of meetings within a year are clearly defined. So yes, we're fine with $180,000, but if we get beyond 12 meetings, we need to start having those meetings added, as well as committee chairs. It's sort of interesting because it's like backwards in that if you do an all-in-one retainer, you have to be very mindful that we are all being paid the same. So if one individual is being asked to chair 2 or 3 committees, and everyone else only has one, those are sort of the analyses and different configurations of jobs within the board that are sort of being critiqued and are documented, right? This means that no director can have more than 2 committees, etc. So it does just sort of shine a light on being pretty precise about what, if you're going to do an all-in fee, what does that include payment for? Because there will be exceptions.
Yeah, and I think too, there's been some examples I've seen where there's an all-in fee, but for example, the committee chairs still get something in addition to that, which I do think, having kind of sat in a bunch of seats now, there is, and depending on the industry and, what's going on, but there can be considerable work for chairs of the, in addition to being not just a member, but a member.
Right.
So I do think, that needs to be taken into consideration and, compensated fairly, I would say.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So equity, lots of questions popping up about the form of equity and the use of equity in directors' compensation. So as Ryan alluded to, in Canada, for larger publicly traded companies, the dominant vehicle is called a deferred share unit, as you well know, Kim. But what we've been finding, and you, I think, as well, is that long-serving directors that have DSUs as an element of their pay, as Ryan suggested, you layer them on, and that's great because they own phantom value of the company until they terminate or retire from the board. But that can add up to a lot of money after, 7, 9, 10 years of ownership, which is good and bad from a retention perspective, asking someone to defer that much money over that period of time, or from a cash liquidity perspective. These are individuals that may need the cash or would rather receive cash or another form of equity. So we wanted to chat with you about, and what have you seen in terms of newer practices as it relates to equity, or any of these considerations that I've raised, if you're seeing them as well.
Yeah, so I haven't, there's a bunch of different scenarios in what I've currently experienced and observed, but I would say that this has become more of a topic of conversation than I would say 5 years ago. And to your point, it's a combination of things. So you're right, a lot of long serving members that have more than reached their sheer ownership requirements. But the only way they can get access to this, and depending on their own personal circumstances, whether or not they need to, is to retire from the board, which may not actually be in the best interest of the board. The point of these are for retention. Now you could argue, well, if they're that long serving, should we be looking at a board, should they be there that long? But 10 years is not that long to be, in my opinion,
Yes.
Serving on a board and really getting into, at a point where you're, I think adding, some great value and, providing some strong governance leadership. So to hand tie them, I'm not sure that's really the goal of this structure of compensation. So then I kind of go back to, well, what are you trying to achieve here? So if flexibility is one of those pillars, what are some other ways that you could do that? So there have been conversations that I've been around that, looking at, could there be a combination of D issues and perhaps R issues as part of that, equity component? So that way, whatever the vesting period is, Ryan alluded to, it's typically 3 years. So then you would have, access over time, which gives a little more flexibility. And I think that's reasonable, to be honest, in terms of and I also think, when you talk about, or when we talk about the importance of diversity around the boardroom table, it's, whether or not, depending on your industry, bringing in some younger folks as well, different generations, there are just different views on all of this now that I think are becoming more, or being brought to life more than they were even a few years ago. So I do think, I know for me personally, there's definitely been a lot more conversation around the board tables that I've been part of, and just hearing my colleagues talk about it as well. So I do think that perhaps we will see more of a at least thoughtful discussion and seeking advice from folks like yourself on how we can actually make this work and still be true to the principles by which you're trying to be true to, in terms of governance, independence, objectivity, all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, I would echo what you are saying with respect to our live conversations that we're having with directors who are looking at their own pay. It's the number one conversation we're having, and you're absolutely right. It was not being had a number of years ago, and it's partly an Emery. You just posted that as well, in terms of a question around diversity and thinking about, as you're trying to get younger individuals on board, hand tying them to forcing them to have a forever, no cash flow for participating in this work. It is a consideration, I think. It's different types of people with different types of backgrounds having access to these roles, and they all don't look the same anymore. And I'd say that, so this is a complicated conversation because the DSU falls under a different section of the Tax Act than most of the restricted share units do. And so what we find is there's an appetite to look at true equity settled units for directors, which many executives have. That's where their stock options reside, but directors traditionally had not. Like Ryan's statistics said, it was less than 10%. So the conversation is around, do we open up this equity plan? How many, there are rules around directors participating in real equity plans. So it gets a little bit complicated, but we see a lot more appetite to do it. And as you said, Kim, when you have these other vehicles, you end up allowing the directors to have the flexibility. It's an individual choice on how I receive my pay rather than a mandate. And so again, their personal circumstances can be considered, as well as our tax considerations and all of that planning. We in fact have one mid-sized mining company that a number of years ago designed this plan. And so they have an equity settled plan of restricted share units. The directors have a tremendous amount of flexibility. Once they've attained their share ownership guidelines, they can elect at the time of their payment. No, actually at the time of they can elect when they receive their cash out of this plan because it's equity settled. So they can defer it until a period of time in which they think they would like it settled in cash. And the only way they can do that is because it's underlying in an equity plan.
Right.
So lots of considerations to be had around that.
And to be honest, Amanda, too, I mean, again, honestly, like compensation was not, again, in the 5 years, 6 years I've been involved, it was not really talked about, to be honest. But now that I'm part of recruiting efforts as well,
Right.
and the new guidelines around that to broaden our search, and now some directors have options. So, and I know it's not just about the compensation, but it's an element of decision when the time comes to which board you're going to choose, among many other things. But I think it's really important, that whatever structure you land on, that it is competitive and fair, and checking all the boxes that it needs to check to make sure you get the best talent on your board.
And I'm going to jump to the question that we have for you on travel pay, because I think it's related to what you just said on recruiting efforts, because I do feel and I see that we're wanting to look broader than we historically had looked for those diverse and best candidates on the director rosters. And so with that, looking at directors across the country or different jurisdictions, what do you see in terms of being paid for your travel? So again, for others listening, this is in addition to your actual fees. This is paying for people for their time. If it were to take 6 hours on a plane to get to the location of the meeting, paying them some fee in order to compensate that. So what's been your experience on travel fees?
So my experience has been that companies that are seeking to go outside of their geographical region now are just now looking at the importance of doing that and recognizing, and some of it driven by the fact through recruitment efforts and recognizing that time is money. So if people are traveling, that is their time, as opposed to others who just have to, get a Uber or walk across the street or what have you. So there is a recognition now of, well, at least in my experience, of having to kind of level the playing field there, and compensation for travel. Also, compensation for support and, completing tax, depending on if you're in a different area or working in a different area. So all those things that, again, I think it's about leveling the playing field, though, for those who are in the immediate area, to keep folks whole, to be quite frank, and if they have to take out of pocket, now granted, you would always have your travel paid for, and to your point, you'd have your fees or whatever, but if it takes a director a day to get somewhere, well, that's a day that they're not doing something else, right? So there's recognition now, and most compensation consultants that I've discussed this with have, they're all recommending the same thing, to be honest.
Yeah, we're definitely recommending it with the right considerations factored. And what's interesting also is that it's not well disclosed. So everyone likes to look at benchmark surveys and look at what their exact peers are doing. And often it's actually not explicitly noted in the way in which disclosure is reported, yet organizations are doing it. So you do need to just talk about it, make sure it's right for you, do the calculation on what is fair and appropriate. As you said, it's not going to be so much about looking at benchmark data in that case.
It's a good point, though, Amanda, because you do that is the first thing I find we all do is like, okay, who else, what's everyone else doing?
Yeah, exactly. And this
so
one's
I think,
not right
and sometimes it's in policies that, again, maybe are not, in the information cert, whatever, But I think grounding yourself, doing the research, obviously, I think talking, getting some good advice,
Mhm.
through your networks. But I also think just, what seems fair and reasonable tends to be, and also, I mean, you could always test it off with, your some of your shareholders too, if there was some concern. But, I think what's fair and reasonable, folks generally don't push back too hard on that.
Yeah, I have one other interesting client who does not pay travel fees, but does move the meeting. So the rationale for not paying travel fees, given the directors are all over the country and in the
Right.
US, is I think that everyone, is compromised at least
Okay.
once a year. So anyway,
Yeah.
it's an interesting anecdote to share as different organizations think about it, because not everyone moves their meeting. It's always Toronto, and that's obviously a burden for someone coming from Vancouver.
Yeah.
As an
But that, to be honest, seems like that's not a bad, okay, that, maybe, maybe.
I'm sure they'll think about it again when they
Yeah,
open.
I do think it's something, I don't think it's going away. And again, I just think as we broaden the director base and just bring in different folks, I think, we're talking about things today, and I'm sure there'll be other things we'll be talking about that we didn't even think about today. So, yeah.
Yes, exactly. How about one more question on this broader market for talent? Currency is a very hot topic as we find more and more Americans coming onto Canadian boards, or even, Europe coming to Canada. What do you see out there in terms of principles used to decide which currency to pay on a Canadian company, Canadian board? Because we do see it's mixed practice.
Yeah, so my experience is not so much with Canadian boards, but outside of Canada, what I would say, and I would say I'm sure there's some similarities, but the conversations that I've been part of or that observed have been around typically the structure of the director comp. The advice given is that it's in the governance structure of the country that your company is in. However, then the conversation comes to, okay, well, how does then the director who's not in that, country or what have you? So the experience that I've observed is that it tends to be then, there's a local based in the currency that the person's living in, fee defined based on an appropriate exchange rate for perhaps over a 2 to 3 year period. That seems reasonable, checked from time to time, but that's typically what I've been observing in terms of, so you're living in Canada, it'll be in Canadian dollars based on this foreign exchange, which is over a 3 year period, so that try to minimize. I think I do feel like the goal is to minimize the fluctuation, which is sometimes challenging. But then with a view to that this has to be tested off from time to time. And then, and typically what I've seen is that this will be rolled into the policy and adjusted accordingly as required.
Yeah, it's definitely a sensitive and it requires a lot of thought when an organization has a North American peer group, and even how you interpret the data, as Ryan was suggesting. What do we leave the US dollars in US currency or convert it to Canadian dollars? US companies tend to pay more to their directors. So not only is their currency higher, their actual pay levels are higher. So when you do a peer group with both in it, there is an inflationary, like an agreed upon inflationary impact to the pay, and then deciding how much to pay, which currency to pay the directors becomes quite sensitive, I find. Because a Canadian company would have had might have had a Canadian set fee. Then an American comes on and they're able to negotiate that it's the same amount of money, but in my home currency, which is US dollars. And poor Canadians don't like that because you're right there, and I'm losing out on 30%. So lots of conversation, including, like you said, there's principles, like what do we report our currency? What does it look like when we disclose it? How many directors are Americans versus Canadians? How do we pay our executives? Do we pay our executives in US currency? It makes it easier to pay the directors in US currency. So lots of considerations and a very complex issue that's going to continue to be topical, I think, as we look to recruiting.
I agree. I don't think any of these topics are getting simpler. More lively and more, but it's at the end of the day, I think as long as we're kind of grounded in what it is we're trying to achieve, I'd like to think that there's, some great folks out there like yourself who are going to help us navigate this. But it's certainly evolving, and it's kind of fun and exciting too, because it's progressive. It's business is changing, governance is evolving, and it's a pretty fun world.
It is uncharted territories, right?
Uncharted territory, yeah.
Thank you so much for your comments so far, Kim. It looks like we want to turn it back to Deborah. There was a million questions popped into the chat. Do you want to pick a few and allocate them out?
Yeah, I'll do my best, Amanda and Kim. What great conversation, and Ryan for setting up from the research itself. The questions started firing away, and I know you tried to answer some of them along the way. So I'll try my best to pull them out. So there is a question specifically, is there similar research for directors' compensation for TSXV listed companies? Amanda, do you want to comment on that?
Comment is not yet. I would say that Southie in particular has not done that, but something we can look into for sure. We haven't seen that published anywhere. It definitely is a different protocol practice, so good for you for calling that out. I mean, lots of stock options granted to venture directors, absolutely very low cash comp for obvious reasons. So it would look very different from the statistics we presented today.
And this is a question that was sort of kind of talked throughout when Ryan was talking about, he defined the different committees, their fees. And so the question is, given the importance of governance, why do you think that the governance nominating and corporate governance committee fees are lower? That's always a debate, but I don't know. Kim, I see you smiling. Do you want to take that one?
I actually think it's because it's just the way it's been, to be honest. I think there's just been a structure in place now. I mean, again, this is my own personal view, but I just think governance, perhaps, I'm not sure it's an indication of importance, although, you could argue that given that, the pay scales or the compensation, I should say, but I feel like that's just the way it's been. And I think now there's just an awakening of perhaps how important it is. And it's I don't know, I think it's difficult to argue. I think it's getting more difficult to argue that audit and some of the others are more, who really gets to determine what is really important in terms of board governance. So I think this is going to get trickier and trickier to try and defend, to be honest. But I honestly do think it's just been, this is the way it's been done. And, it's kind of this hierarchy. And I just think now that with new and fresh sets of eyes coming on the boards, that there's just a lot of questions being asked that folks really hadn't thought about, quite frankly.
And I would just add, Kim, I think it's the opposite. It's not evaluating that it's worse. It's that there were shocks in the system that created a frenzy around elevating audit and then elevating HR, because it was like the all committees were the same, I believe, and the financial crisis happened, and everybody over their shoulder, oh my gosh, this is way more important than we thought. And then Say on Pay happened, and we were like, whoa, like this is a really critical role. So I think it's more that the governance is catch-all and hasn't had a shock yet to sort of identify that there's a specific need for a premium.
No, that's a really good point, because we do tend to react when something happens and provide more, compensate with more rules and focus and things like that. So yeah, that's a really good point, man.
So there's two kind of administrative questions, and I'll just respond to them. I don't think I'll go to the panelists. Will you be tackling D&O liability insurance? And what I will say, that is a topic onto itself, and that goes way beyond the director's compensation. So that's probably a topic that we can deal through with our speaker series in the future. Another administrative question was, will you be getting the slides? And the slides will be coming shortly after the presentation today. Will come in your thank you note. So thank you, Amanda, Kim, and Ryan for sharing those slides. So I'm going to go to a more specific question. Can you elaborate on the governance issue with stock options rather than shares? And maybe I'll start with you, Amanda, and Ryan, if you want to pipe in.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead, Ryan?
Yeah, I think it's just, again, to Amanda's comment around the TSX venture, you do see stock options being used, particularly At the more junior levels, you also see them more prevalent being used for executives within junior companies that have a higher sort of risk reward potential. I think though, as companies mature, there's increasing concerns, particularly from a governance perspective, that stock options, given their inherent performance bias, you only make money out of stock options if the share price goes up. Does that potentially bias or create a conflict from a director's role in overseeing the company, overseeing the company's performance? And does that bias them in a certain way that doesn't necessarily reflect sort of alignment and with shareholder interests, where a shareholder goes up or down with the share price? If you had a lot of stock options, you're only going to make money if the share price goes up. And so you might not be perfectly aligned with shareholders. So I think that's where some of the governance concerns have come up historically, is that, is it a good vehicle, particularly for larger companies, as a reward mechanism for directors, and or are they better aligned by using share units that have a one-for-one relationship with changes in share price?
Maybe this will kind of be a follow-on to that question. Is there a DSU equivalent for private company boards, a mechanism that allows equity to be used as compensation, but where tax impact is deferred? I don't know, Ryan or Amanda, if you want to speak to that.
I can just very quickly, the short answer is yes. The rule isn't specific to public companies. There are some specific rules associated with the use of the DSU that it needs to rely upon the capital shares of the business. So if you have a valuation tied to the company price, even within a private company, there are ways to use DSUs.
Okay, good. I'm just mindful of time. There's been no shortage of questions. And maybe what I'll do, I think I'll probably take one more question, but Amanda, Kim, and Ryan, are you okay if questions weren't asked, they could reach out to you on LinkedIn or on email if they have your email? Are you comfortable with that if they didn't get their answers?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay. So I have one last question to end on, and these have been phenomenal questions and great engagement. So thank you from our women, for those from our Women Get On Board community and some of Southleigh Group's clients. In addition to retainers, to what extent are you seeing additional fees or dollars for technology or for training, like education?
Do you want me to take that, Amanda?
Yeah, please, Kim, go for it.
Yeah. So so there's typically boards that I've participated in and others that I'm aware of have strongly encouraged continuing education development, whether that's actual coursework, conference attending. So there's and typically all the boards I've been involved, we actually disclose that, so it's almost an expectation. So so I would say there's a definite focus on that in terms of making sure that we all remain current, and perhaps spend some time in areas that we may not necessarily have a strong knowledge of or an expertise, some theme that's emerging or something we feel like the board we feel is important from a continuing education perspective. So it's always been a focus of mine personally, but of the boards that I've participated in as well.
Thank you, Kim. So I know we could continue this conversation. People are dropping off and saying great session, great information. I just want to thank Amanda, Ryan, and Kim today for showing up and sharing their knowledge, their experiences. It had some good research, but some real practical insights. So I want to thank you all. From Women Get On Board, we like to donate to our charity partner, Dress for Success, for your time today. And then thank you so much, Southleigh Group, for being the sponsor of our speaker series. We are very excited. Our next speaker series will be Executive Comp Trends and Best Practices Part 3, June 8th. We've already got lots of registrations and continued. So thank you, Southleigh Group. Also want to thank everyone for joining us today. Post this session, right following the session, you will get a thank you follow-up that will have a feedback survey. We welcome that to hear back from you on the session and any future topics you're interested in. Also, you will get the slides from today's session, and then You will get a recording of this session because I know some people had to drop off earlier or weren't able to meet us. Those to attend today, those will go out in the next few days. So I just want to thank you all for taking your time to become more empowered on your board journey and learn more about, as a director, what you should be fairly compensated. Great session. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Deborah.